Hello, I'm Kyle Weddington, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you as a membership benefit of Heritage Ohio. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people to save the places that matter, build community, and live better. Today, we will have a presentation on the National Trust Grant Program. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it in the question box at any time. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Our presenter today is Diana Maxwell. A native of Western New York, Diana Maxwell has a bachelor's degree in communications from Cornell University and a master's degree in museum studies from George Washington University. She has worked at the National Trust since 2009 and has managed the grants program since 2013. With that, I'll hand it over to Diana.
Thanks, Kyle. Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody listening in. I just wanted to start off with, if you've ever, sent the grants department an email or given us a call, you may wonder what we look like. That's me. And then my other colleague in the grants office is Jordan Torrance. And this is all of our contact information. We're located in Washington, D.C. in the National Trust headquarters building at the Watergate office. This information will be on the slides later as well, but just to kick us off by letting you put a face to the names if you've ever contacted us. I feel like that's helpful to have. So today, this is just our agenda for the day. I'm going to start off talking about briefly about the National Trust Forum program and forum membership and why you should care about it. Then I'm going to talk about the National Trust Preservation Fund, our special grant funds, the grant application process, and then we'll answer questions at the end. So to start off, the Preservation Leadership Forum is a membership group of the National Trust, and the primary reason you should care about it for the purposes of this webinar is that it's the way to access grant funding. So organizational members of Forum are eligible for our grant programs. That's a $250 membership per year, and in addition to access to the grant program, you get access to resources, in-depth publications, discounts on trainings and conferences. You can learn, have networking opportunities. We have about 2,000 members of the program across the country, so that's kind of a great way to connect with other preservationists. And as I said, it's also the way that you are eligible, one of the ways that you're eligible for a National Trust grant. So our largest grant program are the National Trust Preservation Funds. We have over $1 million available nationwide. They're small grants for planning and education for planning for preservation projects or education preservation projects. They typically range from $2,500 to $5,000. They're awarded to nonprofits or government agencies. 3 deadlines a year. The next is February 1st, so you've got some time to get your application together if you want to apply that round. They require a 1-to-1 cash match. So our grant funds are made up of individual endowed funds that are typically geographically restricted, usually by state, sometimes by region. We also have some that are programmatically restricted, like the Battlefield Fund, which, as you might guess, funds preservation projects on battlefields, or the Modernism and Recent Past Fund, which again funds projects that have to do with buildings and structures that are modern or from the recent past. For all of these, though, you don't need to apply to a specific fund. This was the case if you've applied for a grant several years ago. You may have applied for a specific fund. That's not the case now. You just apply to the National Trust Preservation Fund with one of these 3 deadlines. Ohio does not have a specifically designated fund. So this means that competition for these preservation funds in Ohio, for projects in Ohio, can be particularly high. So I'd encourage you to see if you have a project that you're thinking about, seeing if it fits into one of our special funds, which I'll talk about later. It doesn't mean you shouldn't apply for the preservation funds, but it's just something to keep in mind. Also, I heard we may have some folks on from Kentucky. Kentucky does have designated funds. So the funds came from individual donors or groups of donors, so that's kind of why it's a little bit strange in terms of having money in some places and not in others. Not something you really need to worry about, but it's something to kind of be aware in the back of your head. So what kinds of projects can you do for planning projects? So this slide shows some of the kind of general areas of types of projects we'll fund that are preservation planning projects. Basically, it means no brick and mortar work, so no physical preservation work, but all of the stuff leading up to that to try to be the seed money for your preservation project. So an example of this was a grant we gave in Texas to Historic Fort Worth. It was a historic resources study of the Fort Worth stockyards. So we gave $5,000 to the organization to hire a consultant to develop a historic resources survey of their National Register designated historic stockyards in order to help them strengthen their National Register designation, which was done in 1978. Another example, also in Texas, was a historic structures report for a school from the 1870s. This was for a museum in Texas. So those are the sorts of planning projects. For education projects, it's things that are tied to preservation education programming. The photo here actually is from a project we funded in Los Angeles through UCLA, and it's the IM Lab interpretive walks. And in these walks, they take folks, they're monthly walks, highly researched and thematic, that they celebrate the history of the neighborhood surrounding the new Los Angeles State Historic Park in downtown Los Angeles. And they have a public map-based website where the walks are stored and shared. So participants are given a packet of custom designed cards, and that's what you see kind of overlaid on this photo here, featuring historical imagery and the exact locations through where the walks pass. So they start at different places, and it gives the opportunity for the attendees to have a dialogue about this part of the city that's rapidly changing. So that's the type of project that we're sort of thinking about when we say preservation education projects. In the same sort of pool of money, which has a separate application, we do have some emergency or intervention funding. So this is for emergency situations, unanticipated situations. Again, it's only for nonprofit agencies, nonprofit organizations, and public agencies. These grants range from $1,000 to $5,000. There's no cash match required. We understand if it's something tragic or sudden that's happened, your organization may not have funds on hand to match. So that's why we don't require the match there. We would ask if you have a project here, you give us a call. There's still no brick and mortar work allowed with this funding. The funding is restricted by our original donor agreement, so this is why this is the case. Oftentimes these are used for a structural engineer to come in after, say, a fire or some other sort of structural issue. But it could also be something like a planning study if a road was going to come too close to a historic property. We have a blog post about emergency funding up on our forum website and the savingplaces.org blogs, and we have a link to that from our grants website as well, so that gives a little bit more information. But basically, give us a call or send us an email if you think you have an emergency issue, and we can talk you through that and see if you're eligible, and also if we have funding available. In some cases, we may not. So the example here was a grant we gave to the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, which was a stabilization and reconstruction design for Historic Gaines Hall at Morris Brown College, and that's pictured there. There was a fire at that building, and the Georgia Trust engaged a structural engineer who designed a bracing system to support the exterior walls and a new interior walls. The current or the existing interior walls weren't salvageable, and a roofing system. And this building was just a few blocks from the new Falcon Stadium, so they're hoping that the neighborhood's economic boom from the stadium will bode well for adaptive reuse of the building going forward. So that was a little bit on our National Trust preservation funds. And now I want to talk about some of the special funds we have that have either kind of different deadlines or areas of focus. These also each have a separate deadline, so it's a deadline that doesn't go along with those three deadlines of the preservation funds. So these are the four that I'm going to talk about: the Johanna Fabro Fund for Historic Preservation, the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund for Historic Interiors, the Hart Family Fund for Small Towns, and the Peter Brink Leadership Fund. So the Fabro Fund is in many ways pretty similar to the National Trust Preservation Fund. They're for planning and education grants, but the range goes a little bit higher. It's up to $10,000. There's only one deadline. This is early spring. And these, because the Fabro Fund and the Mitchell Fund, which I'll talk about in a moment, they both have a longer lead time in terms of notification. Last year, the applications were due March 1st, but applicants weren't notified until July 1st. This is because they're donor-advised funds, so they just take a little bit longer to kind of sort through and make decisions on. So that's just something to be aware when you apply, that it is a little bit longer of a lead time. The great thing about these, though, is that range is a little bit higher, that $10,000 range. So I'd encourage you, if you were interested in this fund, to sign up on our website for email notifications. We haven't totally decided the due date for these for this year, but it will likely be early spring. And if you sign up for that email list, then you'll get the notification when that application is due. So the example of this project, this photo is of Notre Dame of Maryland University in Baltimore, and they used their Fabro Fund grant to hire a preservation consultant to create a preservation plan for the exterior of this building, which is Gibbons Hall, which housed the first Catholic college for women in the United States to award a 4-year degree. So that's the Fabro Fund. And then the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund kind of goes along with that. It has the same deadline, again, will be early spring. And this is for planning and education grants, but it's limited to the interior of a historic building. So again, they range up to $10,000. And the example here is actually at Texas A&M University. They received a grant in 2003, a $10,000 grant, to prepare a preservation plan for the decorative painting treatments of Scots Hall, which is what you see here, and you can see that kind of agricultural mural up at the front of the classroom. Another of our special grant programs is the Hart Family Fund for Small Towns. Again, this funds planning and education grants. In this case, it's limited to projects in small towns where the population is less than 10,000. So this is actually slightly higher than it was last year. The donors have agreed to make it for slightly larger small towns. And these also can go up to $15,000 grants. Again, it's a one-to-one cash or match required nonprofits and government agencies, and this deadline is May 1st, so it's a little bit later. And this one is usually closer to, doesn't have as long of a lead time in terms of notification like Fabro and Mitchell do, although it can sometimes be a little bit longer. An example of this project was in Lakeport, California. We gave the city of Lakeport $5,000 to support a feasibility study for the reuse of a 1918 Carnegie Library that was sitting vacant and owned by the city. The library was in near original condition and had been well maintained, but the community wanted to find a new and a best use for the property and open it to the public. So they used their Hart Fund. As you can see, kind of with all of these, it's the beginnings of projects, it's to figure out next steps and to get kind of that seed money in initially to move the project forward. This last one is a little bit different than the others. The Peter H. Brink Leadership Fund is for mentoring and between preservation organizations, basically. So Peter Brink was a longtime National Trust staff member, and when he retired a number of years ago, he wanted to set up this fund to encourage this mentoring on a peer-to-peer basis. So what this grant allows is reimbursement of travel costs and honorariums for a mentor, up to $2,500. This is on a rolling basis throughout the year. You can email us for more information and to find out how to apply to this fund. We can send you the link to the application. An example of this from last year, Preserve Granbury in Granbury, Texas, had Esther Hall, who was chair of the National Alliance of Preservation Commission, go to Granbury to mentor the group in leadership training and strategic planning. So Ms. Hall led the executive board through a board development assessment checklist exercise and then later provided training to the full board on the basics of boardmanship. The group reviewed and updated their strategic plan for the upcoming year as well. So this is sort of the organizational development, a little bit of planning. If you have you sort of have to have an idea for this in your mind ahead of time, but you're welcome to call us and we can talk you through this some more about what this could entail. So that's the quick and dirty overview of our different grant funds, and then now I'm just going to go through a little bit about the grant process. So all of our applications you apply online. It's that website. Up there is actually our overall grants page, so that'll give you all of our guidelines, links to all different grant funds that are special grant funds, and then we'll have a link to our grant management system, which is an outside page run by an outside company. So you will need to sign up on that page, on that grants management page, with a login and password, and this is a different login and password from your forum login or from a National Trust membership password. So sometimes folks lately have been having trouble logging in, and we find out they're on the wrong page. We have a new website, and so I think things are just in a different place than people were expecting. But on that website, you can read the guidelines for our grants, the criteria, and the application deadlines. And once you click through, log in to our grants page, the application is typically live 2 months prior to a deadline. So our February 1st round application is live now. You can go check that out if you'd like. And some of the things we'll need to have you submit are 3 letters of endorsement, tax-exempt status of your organization, a resume of the personnel administering the project, a list of board of directors, and a letter of consent from the property owner if you are not the property owner. And we also ask a number of, I think, pretty straightforward questions about the project. Have you upload a budget sheet to tell us pretty basically where your income's coming from and where your expenses are going to. And then grant recipients typically find out if they received the grant or not after 8 weeks, 2 months. So the review process looks something like this. First, the application is checked in by grant staff for basic eligibility, and at that point we may follow up with you for clarification or for additional information, and we do all of this check-in after the grants are due, so we don't really look at them until that due date. Next, the applications are reviewed by grant staff, by National Trust field staff or other staff in the National Trust, sometimes by partner organizations if we have questions or if we have certain funds where we work with partners. So that's the review process. And then the decisions are made by a grants committee, and this can be made up of grant staff, our vice president of field services, or sometimes an external grants jury that's made up of National Trust staff, the donors. Those 2 funds I was speaking of earlier, the Fabro Fund and the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Fund, both have family members of the original donors involved in the grant decision process, and then an external juror as well. And then finally, the applicant is notified about the results of the grant. This is typically 8 weeks from the due date, and as I've mentioned before, occasionally it can take a little bit longer, but if that is going to be the case, we try to let you know ahead of the time, either when you apply for the grant or sometimes if some things come up with timing, you may get an email from us, closer to the deadline. So if you receive a grant, that's great, and we will work with you to get the money out to you, get a grant agreement, get everything started for your project so you can go on ahead and do good things with your sites or buildings, but sometimes you don't get a grant. And why is that? So these are kind of the primary reasons why you may not have received a grant. The most common reason why you didn't receive a grant is because our funding is limited. As I mentioned earlier, while we do have national coverage with our grant program, our grant funds come from geographically restricted funds, and so different locations have more competition for the grants. So that's really the primary reason, is your project might be a great project, but we may just not have money, or we may not have money left since our funds are for the whole year. The second reason is that there aren't matching funds. So your grant has to have a 1-to-1 cash match. If you don't have that, then we can't give you a grant. You also may have some problems with eligibility. So maybe your project doesn't meet our guidelines, or you don't have enough eligible expenses. Our minimum grant is $2,500. We don't want to give grants less than that whenever possible. So if you only have $1,000 or $800 in eligible expenses, then we're probably not going to give you a grant. So here's an example of where people sometimes get tripped up, is in having eligible expenses and doing that. So you have to have enough eligible expenses that both our grant and the match to our grant would cover those eligible expenses. For example, if you have a $10,000 project and you're asking for a $5,000 grant, you have $5,000 in matching funds from a local foundation. That's great. you have the one-to-one cash match you need. So that's check, check, check. But if that $5,000 of your project is to hire an architect to create drawings for you and $5,000 is for the contractor to do work to your building, you would only then be eligible for a $2,500 grant because only $5,000 of your expenses are eligible. So this is where we run into issues sometimes. Again, we try to note this when we see your budget, and we may come back to you and let you know, but that could be why you didn't get a grant, or sometimes you get a grant smaller than the one you've asked for. And finally, the project maybe it's not the right fit for us. It's either not preservation focused. A lot of times we see this with educational programs. They may sound like great programs, but they're really more humanities type programs than they are preservation history programs. Or it's not the right fit for you. If you're working on an educational project, but from photos and from what you're telling us, it looks like the roof of your building's about to cave in, that doesn't seem like maybe it's the right project for us to fund at this time. So the best way to do this is to reach out to us before you apply. We can talk through your project to see if it makes sense for the funds we have available, either on the phone or by email. And sometimes the timing is off. So if we've spent all of our funding for the year, you may just want to apply again. So coming up this February deadline is the last deadline of our fiscal year. So this can go either way. Sometimes that means that we have a very limited amount of money left. Sometimes it means that it's the last round of the year, so we may be more likely to give to your project. It can go either way. It depends on the project. But that's something to be aware of in February. And if you applied in February and got a notice that said, I'm sorry, we didn't get a grant this round, but please reapply in June, it may have just been the case that we just didn't have any funding available for your project. We also ask that you consider a special fund. We may recommend this to you either on the phone or by email, but you can also we also may consider your project ourselves. And we usually tell you about this if it's something that we're going to consider for one of the special funds, just so you have a heads up on that. But that's something we may encourage you to do as well. So with that, I feel like I've covered what I had planned to today. So Kyle, if we have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
All right, I have one question currently. Do the emergency grants still have to be applied for on the 3 preservation deadlines, or are those funds available anytime?
That's a great question. Nope, those are rolling. So that would be, it's anytime, you just need to call us or email us.
If you guys want to type questions in the question box, I'll give you a little time to do that. I got another question. Can you comment more on the geographically focused funds? Which ones are they?
Yeah, so I think we have a list, all of our funds, well, I shouldn't say that. Well, the majority of our National Trust Preservation funds are geographically restricted. They were given as gifts and made to be geographically restricted. So I think we have a list on our website of the states where they're available. I think. Like I said, we switched over to a new website this summer, and I'm still remembering if we moved that or not. If not, give us a call. I can tell you Ohio does not have a designated fund. Kentucky does. It just depends on where these funds started back, well, they started in the 60s, but kind of went up through the early 2000s in terms of asking for the funds, and the focus was trying to get nationwide coverage, but it just wasn't something that happened. So it's not that we don't like Ohio and would love to fund projects there. Sometimes it's just we didn't have a donor who gave us a fund.
Next question. Do any of the grants require the property to have the National Register status?
It's not required to be on the National Register. The application does ask if it's designated, and that can be national, state, or local, but it doesn't have to be.
Is there an emergency period for the emergency grant? What about projects that were affected by an emergency or serious neglect and haven't been looked at for some time?
Yeah, that's a good question. Typically, with a project that's been neglected, it depends on the situation. If the case can be made that this was the first time, say your organization just bought this building that had been neglected by a previous owner, the case might be made then that it is an emergency situation, but it really depends on the project. If it's something like a flood or a fire, I would say we would want to hear from you as soon as possible, but I would say within a few weeks. But again, it's a case-by-case basis.
Next question. Can you explain the difference between humanities and education projects?
Sort of, I can. Basically what I was saying when I said humanities was saying that our education projects are focused on preservation projects, not humanities projects. So something where it might be a general history education program, but that's not tied to the site or tied to the building. That's the kind of education project that we wouldn't fund.
Can you apply for more than one grant for a particular, for instance, the Fabro and the Fund for Interiors?
Yep, you can apply for both the Fabro and the Mitchell Fund. You're likely to only receive one of those. So you're welcome to apply for both. But it may behoove you to put in the stronger one or the one that you need more.
So to clarify, Ohio-based organizations cannot apply for the funds at all, correct?
That's incorrect. Ohio preservations can definitely apply for the funds. We do have a pool of funds that are not part of the preservation fund that are nationally available. It's just Ohio projects would be competing with other states for those funds that are available. So there's other states besides Ohio that don't have funds as well. So Ohio just doesn't have a specifically state designated fund, but there is some funding available. That might be as clear as mud, I'm sorry.
Any other questions? If you have any more questions, just type them in the question box. Here's one. How does the application process change when a building being discussed is not owned by a preservation or government agency?
So the process doesn't really change. The issue is that we can't give money to an organization that's not a government agency or a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So someone else could apply on behalf of that organization, or so if it's, say it's a organization that's only a state recognized nonprofit, not a federally recognized nonprofit. That organization could come in with the application. We're going to flag that and we're going to send you an email when we're checking those in and say, hey, we see that you're not a nonprofit. We can't give you money unless you have a fiscal agent who can receive the money. So typically that's something you need to find before the project starts or at that point. And if you can have a fiscal agent and you let us know who that is and you show us a letter basically saying, organization A is able to act as fiscal agent for organization B and here's our 501c3 status, then that's fine.
Can you give another example of a use of the Cynthia Woods Mitchell grant?
Sure. We've used it in other, this is not a specific place, but we've used it for things like wallpaper analysis or paint analysis studies in interiors. That's kind of what we use it for most often. Sometimes we see them come in for furnishings plans as well. And I think we have also decided that stained glass windows also can be considered interior as well. So if there was any sort of planning work to do work on stained glass, that could be a Mitchell fund as well.
Do you know what percentage of the funds are available in Ohio?
It's not, I'd have to do some math, so not off the top of my head.
If there's no more questions, I think with that we'll end. Thank you, Diana.
Sure.
I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today. For our calendar of upcoming events, including our future webinars, please visit us at heritageohio.org. Heritage Ohio's next webinar will be January 4th at 1 p.m. We will be presenting Heritage Ohio's staff favorites, some of the best practices we've seen in revitalization and preservation. Thank you.
Thanks.